I would describe myself, first of all, as a cat lover. You can probably see in the background two of my current cats. I love all animals, but cats are my specialty, my special heart. And other than that, I have many other interests, but cats are my heart and soul. We were a military family, so we moved all over the world. So we got exposed to a lot of different people, a lot of different cultures, and we met some interesting animals as well. We had snakes, we had turtles, we had birds, we had fish, and those are probably the major ones. So I grew up with all kinds of animals. The cats that I have now, one of them I adopted after seeing his picture online from the local shelter, and this was after I had just lost a favorite cat. And I'm not the type of person that says, "Oh, if you've lost an animal, go right out and get a brand new one." That I find does not allow the grieving process to take place, which it's going to be unique for every person. Every person experiences grief in a different way. And when you've lost a child, when you've lost an animal, when you've lost a grandparent, nobody tells you, for a human, go out and get another husband, a child, or a grandparent, whatever, because you understand that with people, you can't replace them. You always have the memories. But people don't always understand that one animal is not indistinguishable from all the others. Much like humans, they each have their own individual personalities, idiosyncrasies, and learning that as part of the relationship is important. It helps build the relationship. It helps create the bond, the animal-human bond that is so important for both the animal and for the human. The animals that we have as pets, of course, originally were wild animals, but over the millennia, they have either been domesticated, self-domesticated, or in other ways learned to live with humans, and at the same time humans have learned to live with them as well. So their wild tendencies have been reduced somewhat in some species, very much in other species, dogs for example. But one thing that's always important is you can make a generalization about a particular species, a particular type of animal, but that is not always going to hold true for a particular animal. Just like people, they have personalities. As a feline behaviorist, my main role is to work with the owners of an animal, a cat, that has a behavior that is troubling them. So one of the first things that I do is I have to identify, is this a natural behavior for the species, or is this an idiosyncratic behavior that is problematic for that particular animal, for that particular owner? A lot of my work is educating people as to what normal and acceptable feline behavior is, and which behaviors you can alter, which ones you cannot, and which ones are medically originated, and therefore need the intervention of a veterinarian. When you work with a problem animal, once I've made the determination that that particular behavior can be mediated, then I have to get the buy-in of the entire family, not just, in many cases, it's the wife or the woman that contacts me, and I have to make clear that no mediation, no behavioral adjustment is going to take place on a lasting basis if the entire family is not bought into it as well. So I give them education on how to change specific behaviors, whether they can be, excuse me, behaviorally addressed, whether they can be environmentally addressed, and of course, the most important one is whether or not this is a a medical behavior that doesn't need veterinary intervention. So basically, I'm not working with the cat itself as much as I'm working with the people that that animal lives with, that the cat lives with. So it's fascinating. It's rewarding, and I've worked with. I've been in private practice. I've worked with veterinary clinics, with adoption agencies, shelters, and even animal control organizations on primarily how I started this was to increase not just the adoptions, but to increase the retention. A lot of times if an individual or family does not understand what appropriate behavior is, or if the behavior is just uncorrectable, then the animal is either returned to the organization that the adoption was obtained by, or to the breeder if it's a purebred animal. And what my original intention was to increase the adoption stick rate. In other words, to reduce the return of the adopted animals. I'm basically retired now, but I still do pro bono behavioral modification. I prefer to do it either in person or where I can see the animal, meet the animal, see the environment that the animal lives in, because sometimes, as I said, when the behavior is something that is related to the environment, and you can change the behavior by changing the environment, that's always going to be less traumatic than a medical intervention or a long-term behavior modification, because habits take a while to undo, and you usually have more success with doing one habit by replacing it with a more acceptable habit. So that takes time.
How many cats have you got at the moment?
At the moment, I have 3. I have a short-haired domestic gray tabby boy, and he's my sweetheart. I have a little black medium-haired girl. I adopted her sight unseen. She was found in a dumpster. I said, I'll take her. And they kept trying to tell me, well, you don't know anything about her. And I said, it doesn't matter. She needs a home. And I'm glad I took her, because she was much younger than I thought she was. She was not weaned. She had some nutritional problems. And of course, she was almost completely unsocialized. So that's one of my specialties, is socializing kittens, especially feral kittens. And so now she's just a real sweet little girl. They really do have a calming effect. Any animal will, actually. It's been scientifically proven that the animal-human bond does create a reduction in anxiety. It regulates your heart rate, and companionship. People think that cats are solitary, but house cats, domesticated cats, were domesticated by being around people. And while they can have they're definitely not dogs. They do not have a dog personality. They do not normally associate in packs, but they adapt to a domestic situation. It becomes a family situation for them. And as a result, they become very attuned to your moods, your behaviors, your actions, your habits. And they then know basically what you're going to do at any time. Of course, they still have their normal feline behavior. Cats tend to be nocturnal. They, in fact, even crepuscular for that matter, which means they're more active at dawn and at dusk, because that's when their particular prey animals are most active. Mice, rabbits, even snakes. So one of the problems that I have frequently consulted on is, how do I keep my cat from bothering me at night when I'm trying to sleep? And the answer to that is, if you don't want the cat to be playing around on your bed at night, then keep the cat out of the bedroom, because they are nocturnal, and They sleep on the average of anywhere from 16 to 18 hours a day, but they don't sleep like dogs do. They don't sleep in one stretch. They catnap. They literally do catnap. It's very rare for a cat to be so completely deep into sleep that they are unable to be aroused. This is usually true for dogs as well, but dogs are more likely to actually achieve REM sleep than cats are. In fact, I don't believe there's ever really been a scientific example of a cat actually achieving REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement, and that indicates that you're in deep sleep. That's the dream sleep. So cats are just going to be cats. They're going to be active. They're going to look for bugs that are active at night. If you have mice, or if they're outdoor cats, they're indoor outdoor cats, they're going to be much more active at night than just about any other species of animal.
You mentioned that you've had a lot of cats, and of course they don't have the same kind of natural lifespan as a human does. So you must have been around an awful lot of cats who die naturally or get hit and die. What's the process you use to grieve? Is it different every time? And if it is, could you explain it?
A lot of it is going to depend upon the particular animal's demise. If an animal is hit by a car or has for example, a heart attack or a stroke, it's unexpected, and it's going to be a shock, absolutely a shock. So that type of grieving is going to be completely different from, for example, a cat that has been aging or has a long-term debilitating disease such as cancer or even feline leukemia, where you anticipate that the animal is going to die and you just don't exactly know when, and you may even have to make the decision to put the animal to sleep, have it euthanized, because the quality of life is no longer adequate for that cat or dog, any pet, to have an enjoyable, restful life. And the compassionate thing to do in that instance, obviously, is to work with your veterinarian and identify the time that is best for you and that pet to be euthanized. That's a different type of grieving. And in that situation, you do tend to do a lot of grieving in the anticipation of the event of the loss. So it's, in general, of course, there are going to be different experiences for any individual, human and animal. Losing an animal suddenly and unexpectedly, you have not prepared yourself for grief, and so it's. I've had people describe it as having the wind knocked out of them, just as though they just were hit in the chest. The grief can be that intense, and that type of grief is different than one that's been anticipated. Then, of course, there are griefs that are where the bond between the animal and the human has been so intense that even though it's not been a sudden thing, but maybe it wasn't a long-term thing. And that's a different type of grief, because you're grieving the loss of something special. I don't want to make a comparison between animals and humans in the sense of, for example, the loss of a child is devastating. The loss of a parent, an aged parent, is not as devastating, but it's still very significant. The loss of a spouse is also extremely difficult. For some animals, the loss of that particular animal is devastating. It really is. whether you've had the animal for, in general, this is going to be an animal that you've had for some time, maybe not the full span of the expected span of that animal's lifetime, but it's been long enough that you feel a very intense bond with that animal. And I've had several cats I've had that experience, and their loss was really, really significant. Other animals, especially when they're an aged animal or they have a long-term illness that you've observed for a period of time, as I said, you have had the opportunity to do the grieving in advance, and therefore it's easier. It's an easier grief to overcome and to move through.
Right, now you mentioned a significant grieving process, and you mentioned earlier on as well about the cat that I guess essentially we're going to talk about now.
Right.
What was special about that kitty, and what was significant about it? Is it he or she?
It was a he. It was a male cat. I had lost, before my husband and I were married, I was living in Las Vegas, Nevada, and when I moved there from Albuquerque, and I took one of my cats with me, and he died at the age 17 of a year-long, actually over a year-long illness that, so I knew I was going to lose him, but it was a very special bond. And when I lost him, and afterwards, I took a couple of days off of work just to grieve because I knew that it was going to be significant. And then my husband and I got married, and I moved back here to Albuquerque, and we purchased a house. And he said I had a couple of other cats at the time, and one I had had originally belonged to a friend who could no longer keep him, and I took Kalichi with me. And we were at a pet food store purchasing food for our dogs and for the two cats that I had. And I had told my husband that because I still missed the cat that I had lost, that I have a special affinity for male tabby cats. For some reason, they just are they seem to have the personality that just clicks with me. And he said, "Oh, look, across the store," he says, "they're having an adoption event. Do you want to go look for a kitten?" And I said, "No, I'm not really ready for a kitten. And when I see the kitten that I want, then I saw Tucker. I saw him, and he was in a cage, and our eyes locked. I walked up to him. He looked at me. They opened the cage. He crawled into my arms, reached up and patted me on the face, looked into my eyes, and that was it. That was Tucker. And so I adopted him, brought him home. He was a brown tabby, and he, from the very, very moment that we met, I knew this was going to be a really exclusive relationship. And sure enough, he was we had the kind of relationship where wherever I was, that's where he would be. He had his own interests, and he would, nap and play. But he wanted to be with me. And when he was not quite 10 years old, he had some physical problems, and it turned out that it was diagnosed as being ankylosing spondylitis, and where there was like an arthritic degeneration in his spine. So it was difficult for him to jump to certain heights. He was a little more stiff in his walking, and he would sleep just a little bit more. And so we had him on medication, but steroids, of course, only go so far. They're not a cure-all. They're only a treatment. But as he got more infirm and more frail, I didn't want to think about I mean, he was not even just 10 years old. That's very young. Actually, that's the prime of his life. One weekend, he just went down. And I knew it was time to have him euthanized. And my promise to all my pets is when it is time to have them put to sleep, I will be with them in the room, holding them when the veterinarian administers the euthanasia drugs. That's a promise I make to them. And in my previous experience, I was also a veterinary technician, so I have assisted at euthanasias and done euthanasias myself. So I know that it's done humanely. I know how to do it. I know the process, and so it's not frightening. It's not a frightening experience for me. My husband can't do it. He cannot be in the same room with him. But as a professional, that's part of my job as a pet owner and as a feline behaviorist. It's part of my responsibility. So I held him while they euthanized him, and I made the decision that of all the other animals that I've had, he's the only one that I knew that I wanted to have him cremated. And others, when they've died naturally, I've buried them on the property. Those that have been euthanized, I've left with the veterinarian. Ones that have been hit by a car and never found, of course, you grieve, but you don't ever know. So you keep the fiction in your head that maybe they were adopted by someone else. The reality, of course, is that almost never happens. So I was prepared. I thought I was really prepared to deal with the loss of this cat, of Tucker. And I had him cremated. They made paw prints of his paws, and good veterinarians, of course, will always be in contact with you later. They usually send a sympathy card, and that happened. My vet knew how much I loved this cat. But as the time went by, I was more and more depressed. I had never experienced this level of grief in my life. And even though it's my job to deal with this type of grief, I found a grief support group and participated in that. And quite frankly, I did as much counseling as the counselor did, because we were with other people who had lost their animals, and I knew how to relate to them, but I didn't know how to apply it to myself. I understood, but I'd never experienced this level of grief before. So I actually eventually saw a psychiatrist because the grief was so intense. And I'm not really entirely certain that this psychiatrist understood the loss of a pet as completely as someone who professionally works with animals did. But he was kind enough, he was compassionate, he understood the grief process, and he worked with me on that. Still, as the days and the weeks went by, I was still waking up in the middle of the night, sobbing for losing my cat. One night I was just had to get out of bed grieving, and I went online, and just on the off chance that I don't know what I was even thinking, I went to the Humane Association. Now, I had managed the Humane Association here a few decades ago, but I was no longer professionally associated with it. And in the intervening years, they have developed a website, and you could do contacts and that sort of thing. And they had a function where you can look at the animals that are available for adoption. This was in January. I knew there were going to be no kittens, because kitten season typically runs from about early April to late September. female cats come into season depending upon the amount and intensity of sunlight there is. And generally that means that they will go into heat and be able to be impregnated between those months where the amount of light and sunlight and heat are higher than during the winter. But for some reason, someone had turned in a kitten for adoption in January. And this kitten would have been born about the same time that I had my cat euthanized. That's, of course, a coincidence. I'm not sure that I believe in reincarnation for anyone. Maybe cats, maybe not. Certainly not for people. But the minute that I saw this kitten's picture, I knew that that was my kitten. And I called them the next morning. I went down that afternoon. They let us spend time together in an adoption room where they could observe us. And it was as though it were Tucker again. He just had the same personality. And we played. I sat on the floor, we played. He got up on my shoulder, he bit my hair, and then he just fell asleep in my lap. And I knew that was the kitten. I knew I needed that kitten. And they neutered him on Monday. I brought him home on Tuesday, and he has so many of Tucker's traits that if I were to believe in reincarnation, I would absolutely believe that this was Tucker reincarnated. It's just, he's very, very special. And the behaviors are so similar. The personality traits are so similar. He's still his own cat, but there was just something about this kitten that I knew that I needed to have.
When you were going through the grieving process with Tucker, obviously that affected you quite deeply. How did your grieving affect people around you? How did they cope with it?
But no one really knew how to talk to me about this. They knew that Tucker and I had a special, very special relationship. The one person that I really think, in fact, I know, who truly understood was my sister-in-law. She's also a big cat lover. And she, like me, she has a special affinity for male cats. And she had lost her Siamese earlier, several months earlier. And so she would check in on me to see how I was doing. And my best friend, who is unfortunately allergic to cats, she made a special attempt to spend time with me. We'd go to the movies together, we'd go out to lunch, that sort of a thing. So I think people were afraid to leave me alone because they knew that my grief was so intense that they were worried about me. And I was very lucky. I was very lucky in that regard, in that the people in my life who love me, one of the things they love about me is my love for animals. And that's one of the things I love about them at all. I've never been able to establish a relationship with someone who doesn't like animals or actively dislikes animals. I'm not sure that it's true that pets are good judges of character. I've seen evidence to support that, and I've seen evidence to the contrary as well. But I do know that I'm not comfortable with people who are not comfortable with animals. So
yeah, I'm pretty much in agreement with you there as well.
right.
If you see a dog that doesn't trust the man, don't trust the man.
Right, exactly. I've had people say, usually it's women, it's my boyfriend wants me to give my cat away. What should I do? How can I rehome my cat? And my advice to her is usually find a different boyfriend. This is not going to work out.
You mentioned your grief there and your friends helping you. What would your advice be to other people who are grieving in similar situations, Judy?
the person that's grieving, I would advise them to be upfront and be honest to people and say that they are grieving. Don't be afraid of being ridiculed. And if someone is insensitive enough to make the suggestion that oh, it was only a cat, there's something wrong with you for your grief, just be very firm and tell them, I lost something I loved, and I need you to understand that this is grief. This is the loss of a relationship. And if you cannot understand that, seriously look at that relationship in your life. Maybe pull back a little bit. Don't be as open. That's a difficult thing to tell people, because usually this will happen to with someone who is significant in their life. And but it's the same sort of a situation where someone wants you to change who you intrinsically are. It's like you can't turn a cat into a dog. You cannot turn someone who is emotionally closed, you cannot open them up. You cannot change someone into something they are not. And that works with animals and people. And I think has to be the basis of a healthy relationship, whether it's between two people, between an animal and a person, or between two animals. Some animals just are not going to get along. You can do whatever you want, and they're just not going to be best friends. They might be able to have a tolerance for each other and not want to rip each other's throat out. This is true with people, just like when you have, well, certainly like in the United States right now, the political environment is very divisive, and people are actually coming to blows over their political differences. Animals are like that too. It's not politics, though. There's something else that we'll never really understand scientifically. But if you look at it, they're just incompatible relationships. And that's something that you might have to look at. Now, if you're on the other end of the other side of the equation, if you have someone who is grieving and you don't know how to help them, one of the best things that you can do, first off, is let them grieve. Don't tell them to stop crying. Don't say, oh, it's just an animal. What you can do is ask them to tell you about that animal, about that pet, about the relationship. Tell me about Fluffy. Tell me about how you adopted this pet. Why did you know? Like you're asking me now. Try to understand. Don't be so quick to judge. Remember that you yourself are not the standard for everybody in the universe. Everybody's different. Everybody grew up differently in different environments, different circumstances. Your life is not the standard for someone else. So take it as the opportunity to get to know your friend better. They will appreciate it. It will help them through their grieving process. And maybe you'll learn something too. It's never a bad thing to learn compassion. It's never a bad thing to learn how to help other people. And I fully believe that once we understand that, we'll be better people and we'll be better friends to the animals, whether they're wild, domesticated, endangered, even strange or odd. I can't stand to watch Shark Week on television. It's an annual thing in the United States, where sharks are portrayed as vicious monsters. They're animals. They live in a different environment than we do. They have different needs and impulses, but it all boils down to they are adapted to their environment, and they do a very good job of it. This is true for any. There's no such thing as a bad animal. Animals evolve to fill the niche that we're in. We're the interlopers. We're the ones that have made things difficult for everybody else. And that's part of the problem, is that we really feel like we're better than animals, and we have more rights than they do. But at the same time, whether or not that's true, we definitely have more responsibilities, and we need to grow up and accept those responsibilities, whether it's to each other, to the animals, or to the rest of the environment. As you can tell, I'm pretty liberal in my philosophies. But I think that's important, is that grief is part of the human condition. It's part of the human experience. It's part of the animal experience. Animals grieve as well. When you've lost a pet, think about the other pets in your family. They've lost a relationship too. They may not have been best buddies, but they had a relationship. And the loss of that relationship is a loss for them as well. Understand that they have a grieving process that they have to go through. And there are things you can do about that as well.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that Tucker was the only kitty, was the only cat, or the only pet that you've had cremated?
The only pet. The only pet.
So, what was the difference? How did that make you feel afterwards? If I can sort of narrate it for you. First off, because it's the first time you did it, so was it the right thing to do? And did that help your grieving process? And if so, how? Was it having him close to you, or?
Yes, it was. It was. With this particular pet, I was not ready to break that bond. I was not ready for that relationship to be over. And even I didn't understand that until, as the grief process continued, my grief was not abating. In fact, it was only accelerating and intensifying. And one of the things that I really feel made a difference was to have. I was so happy to have his ashes. I found an urn specifically designed for pet ashes, and it was one my husband and I felt very drawn to. It was a man and a woman, a couple holding a cat in their arms, and that mirrored our relationship with Tucker. And it just, when I found it, when I saw it, it spoke to me. It really did. And it really did help the grieving process for me, because I felt like emotionally that this represented our love for this cat and his love for us. It was a physical representation of that relationship, and it was a comforting thing for me to see. It was a tangible thing for me to reach out and touch. And so whenever I would pass by it in our house, I could look over at it and say, "Hi, Tucker." And I know intellectually, I know scientifically that there's only a physical part of him there, but that was important to me for him. Whether or not this will happen with any other animal, I don't know. I really don't know. I was surprised. It surprised me. I was surprised myself that I had this sort of reaction to needing to have him physically still with me.
Okay, all right. That's great. Thank you so much, Judy.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Bye.
Take care of yourself.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.